On October 28th of 1975, Melinda Loveless was born as the youngest daughter of Larry and Marjorie Loveless. Some years earlier, Larry had been drafted into the United States Army and was sent to fight on the blood-soaked attritional battlefields of South Vietnam. The experience left him with deep emotional scarring, and as a result, he began to behave very strangely upon his return. Larry began conducting numerous extramarital affairs and was once caught trying on Marjorie's makeup and clothing. When confronted on his infidelities, Larry suggested that he and Marjorie partake of the southern Indiana swinging scene. And by 1974, the Loveless family were living in the upper-middle-class suburb of Floyd's Knobs, Indiana. Their finances were flush and their lifestyle gave the outward appearance of happiness and prosperity. Yet under the surface, all was not as it seemed. Larry remained violent and abusive and refused to share anything but a meager portion of his income with his wife and 3 daughters. Instead, he squandered his income on impulse purchases of cars, motorcycles, and firearms. Extended family members often described the Loveless daughters visiting their homes with empty stomachs, and how the idea of 3 square meals a day was almost completely alien to them. Meanwhile, Larry Loveless was far preoccupied with driving his wife into neighboring Louisville, Kentucky, to search for wife-swapping opportunities. He would often pretend to be a doctor or dentist and introduce Marjorie as his girlfriend. The practice led to several instances of group intimacy, with Marjorie finding them increasingly more disgusting. During one such meeting, Marjorie became so despondent that she attempted to take her own life. She made several more attempts over the years that followed, some of which were witnessed by her young, impressionable daughters. On another occasion, the girls witnessed their father beat their mother so badly that she had to be hospitalized. The extent to which Larry Loveless abused his daughters is frankly sickening, and there would be no way to adequately describe the horrors he inflicted on them without incurring a community guideline strike. If you wish to know the details, I suggest you look it up on your own time, but be warned, what occurred in the Loveless house was nothing short of evil. Thankfully, by the time Melinda was 5 years old, her parents had become passionately involved with the GRACELAND Baptist Church and had sworn off drinking and swinging. Larry went on to become a preacher, while Marjorie once again footed the family's bills by working as a middle school nurse. One could be forgiven for assuming that Larry had completely changed his ways by the time he became a man of God. But unfortunately for his wife and 3 daughters, the reality was quite different. At one point, when young Melinda Loveless began to repeatedly misbehave, Larry arranged for her to be subjected to a brutal 5-hour exorcism. The incident traumatized her beyond belief, and the move only cemented Larry's reputation within the church. But before long, everything he'd worked towards came crashing down when it emerged that Larry had assaulted one of the members of his flock. But before long, everything he worked towards came crashing down when it emerged that Larry had inappropriately touched one of the members of his flock. No charges were ever filed, but the scandal rocked the church and Larry was forced to flee with family to avoid the fallout. The end of Larry and Marjorie's marriage finally came in November of 1990, when Melinda was just 15 years old. Melinda had a friend over, and whilst they were changing outfits in her bedroom, Larry crept up to the crack of the door and began spying on them while they changed. Yet moments later, Larry heard a noise behind him in the hallway. It was Marjorie, and she was holding a knife in her hand. She didn't give him a chance to speak, and although Larry eventually managed to wrestle the knife away from her, the wounds he sustained ensured a lengthy hospital stay. Larry never returned home to his wife and daughters and instead moved down to Florida, where he eventually remarried. This might seem like a long-winded way to introduce a person, but I can assure you, understanding Melinda Loveless's history and psychology are essential to understanding what came next for the traumatized young woman. Around the same time her mother sent her father to the hospital, Melinda began dating a girl named Amanda Hevron. It had been an anxious, excitable, but innocent relationship, but after her father abandoned the family for the sunny climes of Avon Park, Melinda's behavior began to deteriorate rapidly. She got into fights at school, began experimenting with narcotics, and often lashed out at Amanda when the subject of family came up. As a result, the couple began to drift apart, and it's at this point that a young lady named Shonda Scherer enters the picture. Amanda and Shonda had met early in the fall semester at Hazelwood Junior High, and ironically, their blossoming friendship had started out with a fistfight. The pair were sent to detention, and through some subtle note-swapping, they began to get to know one another. By the end of detention, Amanda and Shonda had developed a deep romantic attraction. They soon began dating, but instead of breaking things off with Melinda, Amanda Hevron kept their mutual affairs a secret. She maintained the ruse until October of 1991, when Melinda uncovered the infidelity. Naturally, the already emotionally fragile Melinda was distraught and placed the blame squarely on Shonda for stealing her girlfriend, quote-unquote. After several death threats, Shonda's parents transferred their daughter to a nearby Catholic high school in late November of 1991. A number of these death threats were handwritten, and after the Scherer family forwarded each of them to the local police, they were assured that the issue would be dealt with. Melinda received a brief visit from the cops, and after breaking down in tears under the force of their questioning, she assured them that her threats were empty and were fueled by heartbreak, not bloodlust. The holidays passed without incident, and the Scherer family came to believe that conflict had been averted. But they were wrong, and Christmas of 1991 would be the last Shonda would share with her family. On the night of January 10, 1992, 17-year-old Lori Tackett picked up two of her friends in their hometown of Madison, Indiana, and drove down to Albany to meet up with Melinda Loveless. The group then drove over to Shonda Scherer's home and Tackett's car, and after parking outside, Melinda told the girls to go to the door and introduce themselves as friends. Once Shonda came to the door, the girls claimed to be friends of Amanda, who wanted Shonda to meet her at a place known as Mistletoe's Falls, a ruined stone house located on an isolated hill overlooking the Ohio River. Eventually, Shonda agreed to accompany the girls in Tackett's car, but when she climbed into the passenger seat, she discovered it was a trap. Melinda Loveless had been hiding in the back seat of the car, concealed under a thick woolen blanket, and within seconds, Shonda had a knife to her throat. Melinda began interrogating Shonda of her relationship with her former girlfriend, but there were no correct answers to her questions. No matter how honest Shonda was, no matter how much she begged for mercy, Melinda continued to beat her about the face and neck, whilst intermittently threatening to cut her throat. The girls drove Shonda out to an abandoned cottage known as the Witch's Castle, and once inside, they bound Shonda's arms and legs with rope. Melinda began to taunt Shonda as she sheared the hair from her head, telling her she wasn't so pretty without her bouncing brown curls. Shonda was then beaten and partially stripped before the girls threatened to set her on fire, but fearing the flames might be seen by passing motorists, she was bundled back into Tackett's car and then driven from the area. Sometime later, the girls arrived near a densely wooded area back near Madison. Lori Tackett joined Melinda in leading their prisoner to a dark abandoned building located just off a logging road lined by huge, thick pines. There, Shonda was beaten, strangled, and stabbed repeatedly before being locked in the trunk of Tackett's car. Assuming that Shonda was dead, the girls drove over to Lori Tackett's house to clean themselves off. Then, at around 2:30 a.m., Laura and Melinda went out for a drive again. Whilst they were traveling, the girls suddenly heard screaming coming from the trunk of the car. They pulled over, opened up the trunk, but as they did so, a terrified Shonda Scherer lunged at them, coughing up blood as she attempted to escape captivity. Laura then grabbed a tire iron, then beat her already bloodied prisoner until she was silent. She later claimed to have felt Shonda's skull fracture and splinter as metal collided with bone. Then when she was finished, Lori raised the gore-soaked tire iron to Melinda's nose and told her to smell it. Having assumed Shonda was dead for the second time, the girls drove to a gas station near Madison Consolidated High School, pumped some gasoline into the car, and bought a 2-liter bottle of Pepsi. Yet almost as soon as she'd bought it, Lori opened the bottle of Pepsi, poured out the soda, then refilled it with gasoline. It was a grim omen of Shonda's fate, and after driving her to a place known as RIPPY, the girls dragged her from the trunk, wrapped her in a blanket doused with gasoline, and set her on fire. But Shonda was not dead, and only when she'd stopped writhing and screaming within the confines of the blanket did her killers finally walk away. Lori and Melinda then drove to a McDonald's where they apparently joked about how Shonda's corpse had resembled the meat they were consuming. After getting some sleep, Laura and Melinda traveled over to Amanda Heveron's house to tell her what they'd done. Melinda believed that such a display of violent dedication would win Amanda's heart, but as you can imagine, the young woman was beyond horrified at the admission and refused to believe that Shonda was dead. It wasn't until Lori Tackett showed her the trunk of the car, complete with Shonda's bloody discarded clothing, that Amanda realized that her claim was genuine. Fear drove her to silence, and when Melinda Loveless made her promise to keep quiet about what she'd done, Amanda complied, then retreated to her bedroom to grieve in secret. Lori and Melinda then went about their business, having assured that Shonda's body had been burned to ashes, but that couldn't have been further from the truth. Earlier that day, two brothers from the small town of Canaan were headed for a day's hunting at the Jefferson Proving Ground when they noticed something lying by the side of the road. At first, it looked like a badly decomposed piece of roadkill, but as they slowed down to get a better view, they realized what they were looking at. It was the badly burned body of a young girl who had evidently been crawling alongside of the road for quite some time before she finally expired. The brothers called 911 at exactly 10:55 a.m., and following a brief period of questioning, State Trooper David Cam and Jefferson County Sheriff Buck Shipley joined forces to begin an investigation. Following a brief analysis on the scene, law enforcement's initial theory involved a drug deal gone wrong. In their experience, the kind of brutal violence the victim had been subjected to was reminiscent of violent narcotics gangs, and they suspected that hardened male criminals were responsible. But as we know, the reality was very different. By the time the girl's charred corpse was discovered at the roadside, Shonda Scherer's parents had already noticed that their daughter was missing. After calling around neighbors and friends all morning, they filed a missing persons report with the Clark County Sheriff. The deputy who took their statement warned them that they'd have to be patient, as runaways sometimes took weeks to make contact or return home. The Scherers braced themselves for a lengthy, anxiety-ridden ordeal. Little did they know, Shonda's fate would be revealed in less than 12 hours. Around 8:20 p.m., two hysterical 15-year-old girls walked into the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office with a shocking confession. Their names were Hope Rippy and Toni Lawrence, and they claimed to have been the two other girls present at Shonda Scherer's beating. Having been stunned and appalled by the news of her horrifying immolation, they were desperate to offer their cooperation in exchange for as lenient a sentence as possible. Once it was confirmed that the charred cadaver was indeed Shonda Scherer, Melinda Loveless and Lori Tackett were promptly tracked down and arrested, with the state declaring they'd both be tried as adults due to the severity of the crime. The fact that the four teenage girls would be tried as adults meant that the death penalty was on the table, a prospect which horrified Americans from coast to coast when the news began to circulate nationally. To prevent the issue from snowballing into a wider political issue, the judiciary were quick to offer the girls a plea bargain which lowered the maximum penalty to life imprisonment. One judge cited the serious mental health issues that each of the girls suffered, and claimed a psychiatrist had discovered Lori Tackett suffered from a terrifying form of borderline personality disorder characterized by horrifying hallucinations. An extensive history of the Loveless family's abuse at the hands of their patriarch was read out to the court. Melinda remained chillingly indifferent to the details being made public, while some of those in attendance were close to tears by the time her history of abuse had been recounted. At the conclusion of their trial, Melinda Loveless and Lori Hackett were sentenced to 60 years in prison, plus 10 years medium supervision upon release. Despite her cooperation, Hope Rippy received an extensive 35-year sentence, owing to the fact that she played an integral role in binding and torturing the late Shonda Scherer. Toni Lawrence, on the other hand, was only convicted of criminal confinement and received the lowest sentence of 20 years imprisonment. Lawrence ended up getting released in December of the year 2000 after having served just 9 years of the original 20. Hope Rippy was released in April of 2006 but remained on probation until April of 2011. Lori Tackett served almost 26 years before being released on January 11th of 2018, the 26th anniversary of the crime she was convicted of. Finally, Melinda Loveless, the broken young woman who masterminded an act of pure, unadulterated evil, was released from Indiana Women's Prison on September 5th of 2019. She had served just over 26 years, almost double the length of time she'd been alive at the time she murdered Shonda Scherer. The incident had been fictionalized in a number of true crime primetime TV shows, including Cold Case and Law & Order, but perhaps the most jaw-dropping of television features was an edition of Dr. Phil, which aired on May of 2011. The show featured Shonda Scherer's mother and sister, who harshly confronted a now-adult Hope Rippy. Rippy tried her best to distance herself from the crime, but welcomed the judgment of Shonda's still grieving relatives. It makes for extremely uncomfortable watching, and unlike other very similar attempts at resolution, the meeting is characterized by a stark lack of progress and an absence of forgiveness. But then again, how many of us could truly forgive someone who put one of our loved ones through a living nightmare before finally burning them alive? If you enjoyed this scary story, listen to thousands more, either over on the Let's Read YouTube channel or podcast.